So thanks everybody for coming. It's always hard to follow curing cancer with history, but I'll try. So I'm an early career academic, so I'm still doing a PhD, but I'm also lecturing and teaching in Oxford as well. And so I'm basically going to explain how I went from kind of teenage punk rocker to Victorian historian in Oxford without a kind of major brain transplant. So as Polly said, I went to a similar kind of school to this in the north, and I always loved school. I always worked hard, but I was quite distracted. So I was never a kind of fully committed historian or a fully committed academic. I dyed my hair basically every 2 weeks. I went on lots of protests. I did lots of political canvassing. I had my own teenage punk rock band called Ladyfingers. And so here's me with my banner off to a protest. But I always loved reading and I always loved stories ever since I was little. And I think history in a way is a type of storytelling. And so with all the protests and all the reading, it seemed like a pretty obvious decision to do history and politics at university. And I knew that I would do much better in a utilitarian sense if I did a subject that I was really passionate about and I was really interested in. So again, history and politics. But I also knew that I wanted to live in a city that kind of reflected my slightly quirky personality. And for me, this was Manchester. And I loved that it was very diverse and lots of different types of gigs and nightlife and things like that. And academically, while I was at Manchester, lots of the courses that I studied focused on the development of ideas in history, whether it was in particular periods like the French Revolution or in particular thinkers like Karl Marx or Charles Darwin. And one week we studied a political thinker called Edmund Burke, so this is Burke, and a question popped into my mind that I couldn't answer. And that was when I was in my second year of university, and that's the question that I'm still answering today. So what's the problem? So Burke was born in 1729 or 30, we're not quite sure, and he died in 1797. He was Irish, he was a Whig MP in the British Parliament, so in the 18th century, Whigs were the kind of parliamentary party, and Tories were more kind of interested in monarchical power. And so for the early part of his career, he had a reputation as a political reformer of corruption in Westminster, of slavery, of the treatment of the colonies in America and India. But when the French Revolution broke out in 1789, Burke abhorred this. He wrote one of the most famous attacks on the French Revolution that is known, the Reflections on the Revolution in France. And what this did was to completely split his reputation in two. So the Whigs mostly supported the revolution and saw Burke as a traitor to their party, and the Tories really liked Reflections, but they weren't really that keen on Burke. And so after his death in 1797, his reputation in the early 19th century was really, really split, and lots of people said really horrible things about him. So classic examples were that he'd gone mad, and that's how we can explain this kind of split in his work. People said that his speeches were so boring, they announced dinner, and so he was called a dinner bell. And he was also described as an Irish adventurer that wasn't really a serious political thinker, but had just come into politics to make his fortune. And so you have a problem in that now Burke is known as the founder of modern conservatism. So here's the Conservative MP Jesse Norman with his book on Burke that was released last year. And this is just an example of an American conservative book that kind of places Burke at the head of this kind of ideological tradition of conservatism. And so you have a problem in that in a period of about 100 years, Burke goes from being a mad Irish Whig to being the founder of modern conservatism. And this is the question that popped into my head in my second year, and this is the question that my PhD answers. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about my PhD and about the details of Burke, but I wanted to think more broadly about something that touches on how we can think about cultural and political issues today as well. And that's the issue of why do people feel the need to reinterpret historical figures or particular texts? And I think there's, and this is a central question, methodological question of my thesis. And I think there's a few answers to this. And first of all is the fact that no two people ever read the same text in exactly the same way. It's impossible, because we all approach the same piece of writing, or we listen to the same speech with different interests, different prejudices, different questions. And from this more personal perspective, there's also a kind of wider, there's also a sort of wider historical one, in that as society changes, as political questions change, as the economic situation changes, cultural fashions, intellectual fashions, and also what we learn in schools and universities as educational curricula is reformed or changed, so too do the questions that we approach particular texts or particular historical periods or particular political issues with. And there's also another very important reason as well, which I think one should always be aware of when you're listening to a political speech, or you're reading a newspaper article, or you're reading a scientific journal or a historical journal. And that's that people use sources to back up their arguments, to make what they're saying seem more authoritative, more persuasive, etc. And this is true with historical sources, but it's also true with scientific sources or religious sources or economic things and statistics. And because questions are always changing, contexts are always changing, it means that who and what we think of as relevant or relevant questions to ask are always changing. And I think it's really important to realize that this happens, and because it tells us so much about our society, whether it's a new film about the life of Margaret Thatcher, or whether it's Downton Abbey, or the million period dramas that we've seen this year on the First World War. And in Burke's case, it was a combination of all of these things. So from the mid-19th century, a younger generation of liberals became much more interested in Burke because they were approaching him in a new political and economic context. They read new text they read different texts when they'd gone to university. And they began to appreciate Burke and in a completely new light. So they wrote lots more appreciative texts of him, condemning all the people that called him a madman, and that he really was a consistent and important political thinker. And then after this kind of recovery work had taken place, people felt much more comfortable using Burke in political arguments, whether it was for or against the creation of an Irish Parliament in Dublin in the 1880s, or whether it was arguing against the reform of the House of Lords in the 1910s. And what my thesis has shown is that by 1914, Burke had been quite firmly established as a political conservative and was being used extensively by conservative MPs in their writings and their speeches. And for a kind of contemporary example of Burke's influence, I found a variety of paraphernalia on the internet, such as t-shirts, phone cases, and dog jumpers. And also, interestingly, he was debated on Coronation Street a few months ago, in Roy's Cafe, which was something I never thought that I would see. Contemporary relevance and impact is definitely there. And I wanted to, so that's the kind of intellectual basis of my PhD. And I wanted to finish by talking about what it's actually like to be a historian and to do a PhD and to be an early career researcher on a sort of day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So, the day job. So now I'm in Oxford, and I'm in the third year of my PhD, so I've nearly finished. And I do four main things. Most of my time I spend reading, most of my first couple of years I spent reading, and this is divided between primary sources and secondary sources. So the types of primary sources that I read are mainly published sources, so newspaper articles, histories and memoirs from the time, and parliamentary speeches and speeches outside Parliament as well. But I also read school textbooks and exams and university textbooks and exams like this one. So these are examples of university calendars that were published by Manchester University. Just sort of examples of the kind, they were the real exams that people sat, and this one had loads of questions about Burke, so I was really pleased to find this one. And then I also read secondary sources, which is what other historians have written, not on my question directly, but on themes that feed into my PhD and help me understand the period better. And then the next important thing I do is writing. So a PhD is basically a book. And it's original historical research. So once I feel that I've read enough, primary and secondary material, I start writing. So introduction, conclusion, and then some stuff in the middle. And one thing I really love doing as well is teaching. So I teach 19th century history to Oxford undergraduates, and that's really, really fun because it's not about Burke at all, and it's really nice to teach something completely different. Well, not completely different, but no Burke. And the final thing that I do is give presentations and talks, although they're not usually like this to kind of a general audience, they're generally more to specialist historians. And I wanted to kind of finish off also by thinking about, so how did I end up in Oxford? And the reason for that is purely academic. My heart is definitely still in Manchester. But Oxford just has amazing research facilities. The person that I wanted to supervise my DPhil is there, and it has a great academic research community of lots of other people that work on the same thing that you can go and have a cup of tea with and kind of complain about Burke. And also the Bodleian Library from a historical point of view is amazing because it basically has every book that you would ever want to read. So yeah, my heart is in Manchester, but Oxford's a great place to be a student. And yeah, and then I just want to kind of say, I had no idea that when I was in school, I would end up spending my 20s writing about a conservative thinker in Oxford. But the reason why I got there was because of an intellectual problem that I really, really wanted to solve. And I don't think you should do a history PhD unless you've got this kind of burning question, because sometimes towards the end it can be quite tough. But I definitely had that burning question, and I got that just from always wanting to do what I was passionate about and what I was interested in and what I loved, and that's why I chose my university degree, and that's why I chose to do a PhD. And although I'm only at the beginning of my career, I hope that it's going to be a long and historical one. Thank you.